Here we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris and Hayon. It's so wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm going to share with you tonight a chapter actually that's in a very recently published book co-edited by our hosts tonight, Chris Schulte and Hayon Park. Visual Arts with Young Children, Practices, Pedagogies, and Learning, published by Routledge. And my paper tonight is based on my chapter in that book. And I also wanted to extend special thanks to the children and teachers at Guadalupe Reyes Children and Family Center in Chicago, whose work appears throughout this presentation. My presentation tonight seeks a fuller understanding of children's interests and choices in context of the specific challenges of contemporary childhood. At the heart of this issue is the impact of adultism and childism, both understood as a bias toward adults and against children in the production of culture and attitudes toward children and their potential to shape early art experience. A new materialist perspective recognizes that works of art and the processes through which they come into being are composed through interactions among an artist, a context, and the available materials, both the tangible stuff of which art is made and the personal and cultural materials that provide the discursive substance of the work. This is no less true for young children than it is for more experienced artists. The art they make emerges in specific times and places where they engage in dialogues with materials and ideas at hand in an immanent process that forges its own path. In early childhood settings, where art of this order is allowed to happen, where children are given the time and the space to engage in what Atkinson calls art without criteria, the materials that they draw upon as the subject matter of their work are inflected toward and influenced by two forms of children's culture: their own experiences and those they share with other children of their age. And secondly, the material culture that's designed and provided for them, intentionally or not, by others. This commercial version of children's culture includes the clothing, toys, books, films, furniture, and food that's made for and marketed to children as consumers. But it also inevitably includes many elements of youth and adult culture that children overhear, absorb, and even seek out, despite, or sometimes because of, the fact that these cultural artifacts are not intended for young audiences. With the pervasiveness of easily manipulated digital technologies, the barriers between child and adult cultures continue to erode. With them, the parameters of the child-curated cat aesthetic continue to expand into territories that challenge adult conceptions of what is appropriate for children. Some time ago, at the playground with my granddaughter, I saw a preschooler tumble from a coveted green swing onto the mud below, with both parents within arm's reach. As the child hesitated and then wailed, his parents brushed off his snow pants and proclaimed, one after the other, "You're not hurt, and you're going to be fine." These might have been reassuring words had they not been delivered in tones of exasperation, as both parents walked briskly away from the crying child toward his stroller and their exit from the park. And I thought, how do you know that your child is fine when his dignity and expectations of his own safety and the power of your protection have been shattered by his fall? Do you build his confidence in the world by walking away when he is clearly, for whatever reason, anguished? Several months ago, I was shopping in our local discount store where items are displayed casually in open cardboard boxes, arranged in loosely organized categories: cake decorations here, school and office supplies there, tools and kitchen implements back in the corner. As I sorted through the composition books on offer, a girl of about 8 and her sister, younger by a year or so, returned again and again to a set of off-brand watercolor paints, picking it up and putting it down, opening it to view the glossy half pans and small brush contained within. After a bit, the girls brought their adult companions back to the display. "I want this," the older girl said. "I want to paint." The man at her side, probably her grandfather, looked at the object she had chosen and gruffly refused to accept the watercolor box as the object of her choice that he had agreed to buy for the child. "No, not that," he said. "You will get it all over my couch and make a mess." The girl wistfully returned the palette to the pile and went in search of an acceptable alternative. And I thought, would it not be better to set up a space where watercolors would not stain the furniture and teach the child your expectations for their use, rather than dismissing her desires and eliminating an entire range of occupation from her possibilities? And not to let myself off the hook, sometimes when other adults are present, I catch myself talking about my granddaughter over her head. At 3, she's very aware of this practice and greets this breach of courtesy with a look of puzzlement. She may sense its unfairness. And I watch her pause to listen to those conversations with a cautious look on her face. And I wonder, why do we speak of her as if she's not present when we would not speak of one another that way? Even though, as in this case, the stories we share are often infused with affection and pride, do we have the right to share so freely the daily ups and downs of toddler life? In each of these very ordinary instances, there are sound and defensible reasons for the way adults behave toward children. It's true that the crying child on the playground would survive his fall, and his parents had tried to comfort him. Maintaining the condition of one's furniture is a matter of importance. And sharing stories about a toddler's day is both necessary and enjoyable way of connecting to those who had not been there to share her experiences. But there's also a sense in which in each of these cases, adults overrule and overwhelm children, asserting the dominance of their own priorities and shortchanging the real concerns of the children involved. Halevi Lenz-Taguchi comments that we tend to see adult and child as two poles of a binary, characterized by power and powerlessness, experience and innocence. In this view of the world, the innocence of children is defined rhetorically, if inconsistently, through a seemingly endless series of moral panics surrounding children. Think of the recent controversies surrounding behavior once taken for granted as part and parcel of children's growing up and becoming independent. The alarmed neighbors who call the police when children play unsupervised in the yard, or walk to the neighborhood store, or ride the bus on their own. In part, these expressions of concern stand as recognition of the perils we have allowed to spread through our communities. But in equal part, these reactions bespeak an understanding of children as incapable, indelibly marked as disadvantaged and at risk of error and exploitation. Even adults who've chosen to spend their professional lives among school children, such as university students becoming teachers, are astonished to learn that they have expected far less of children than the children they encounter in early practicum experiences actually know and are able to do. The recent denials of agency to the students of Parkland High School and young climate activists around the world, the widespread assumption that these young people are merely parroting the views of their parents, is another example of the ways that we routinely underestimate children and young people. While we tend to accept all of this as the natural order of things, there's much to be gained if we entertain the notion that other forms of relationship between adults and children are possible. The concepts of adultism and childism highlight the everyday attitude and practices that lead to the systematic devaluation of children in favor of adults who are assumed to be naturally superior in intelligence, strength, judgment, and power. As blogger Richard Cohen suggests, adultism is so pervasive that we fail to notice it in operation. But he suggests it can be seen easily in everyday interactions with children, in the stranger who touches a toddler without asking permission, the parent who grabs her crying son's arm and drags him through a supermarket, the merchant who suspiciously follows anyone under the age of 20 through his store, the teacher who treats a student rudely. A number of authors embrace the term adultism to describe this phenomenon. The unspoken assumption that any adult is naturally superior to any child and entitled to treat children as subservient. Elizabeth Young Bruhl argues that the term childism more accurately describes an attitude toward children that is parallel to racism or sexism. Defining childism as a prejudice against children, she notes that, quote, prejudice is built into the very ways that children are imagined, unquote. Describing the ways in which a range of behaviors are recognized as emerging from a common set of attitudes toward women, once the term sexism allowed them to be so identified, Young Bruhl believes that naming the phenomenon and popularizing the term childism will lead to recognition of a similar array of connected actions and attitudes toward younger human beings. Offering an early definition of childism as the presumption of superiority of any adult over any child, Pierce and Allen vividly illustrate the abrasions that its victims accrue. The vehicle for most adult actions is microaggression. The child is not rendered a gross brutalization, but is treated in such a way as to lower his self-esteem, dignity, and worthiness by means of subtle, cumulative, and unceasing adult deprecation. As a result of this constant barrage of microaggression, the child remains on the defensive, mobilizing constantly to conform and perform. This incessant mobilization is not without cost, psychologically and probably physiologically. Seen in the deficit model of childhood that permeates much educational thought and practice, childism refers to the unquestioned assumptions that render any adult's account of a situation intrinsically more reliable than a child's. Rooted in a lack of confidence in children's capacities to reason or to choose, the dominant approach to public education demonstrates a gross lack of respect for and understanding of young children's ability to manage their own lives in an age-appropriate way. Students simply are given little choice about matters of consequence related to their education: what to learn, when to learn, who to learn with, where to learn, who should teach them, and so on. Similar in its recognition of the devaluation of children's perspectives is the concept of epistemic injustice, articulated by Miranda Fricker, who identifies, quote, prejudicial stereotypes of child irrationality, suggestibility, and unreliability that result in dismissal of children's testimony in matters large and small. Systematically wronged in their capacity as knowers and thus made to feel less human, children's opinions and preferences are seldom taken seriously or considered informative enough to merit interrogation. Erica Berman explains that the assumptions of childism and adultism are promoted by the developmentalist perspective that long prevailed in psychology and education. This is a long quote from Erica Berman. Developmental psychology, as a modern northern minority world, discipline has been wedded to an individualist model of child development that treats the baby or child as an isolated unit of development. Within this paradigm, the child develops according to regular, predictable patterns, sometimes described as stages, that are presumed to be largely universalist in their structure. Yet, this universality is actually culturally specific. It represents the culturally Anglo-US, white, middle class, masculine subjectivity of the mid-20th century. As a result, cultural diversity is subordinated to this naturalized in the sense of rendered as inherent or pre-given, and normalized, treated as the benchmark for evaluation of acceptable versus deviant ranges of diversity, linear models of development. End of quote. Intrinsically developmentalist and invidious in its assumptions, childism is particularly harsh in its treatment of children who do not reflect the abstract image of the ideal child. As Berman notes, quote, children in modern industrialized societies, that is in the North, symbolize what is natural and good, spontaneous and authentic, fueling discrimination and racism toward children who do not fit this mold. Quoting Berman again, children whose life circumstances and practices of living fail to conform to these idealized norms suffer further marginalization or even pathologization. Thus, we see refugees, children, and youth cast as potentially violent others, not accorded the presumption of innocence that we project onto white children. The impact of this presumption is dramatically highlighted in the detention of brown children along our southern borders, the push out of Black girls from American schools, and the suspension and expulsion of preschoolers deemed to be too disruptive. But it's equally apparent in the popularity of the book, Go the F to Sleep, and the humiliation meted out to children whose parents are distracted or poor enough to lapse in their lunch payments to school, designed to serve children and families. Recommending that we move away from the prototypical child as the developmental subject or the unit of development, and instead talk about diverse children and childhoods, Berman also advises that we must move away from the traditional abstracted storytellers of development, that is us, and as researchers, policymakers, and educators, those who work for, with, and around children, begin to address what our positions and locations might mean for how we interpret and engage these issues. A long quote from Erica Berman: how we see children, children as our future, children as our individual or collective past, children as good, innocent, and sacred, or children as beastly and uncivilized. These are all key cultural resources that inform our frameworks for what development is considered to be for, its starting points and goals. This tells us about ourselves, about what we are supposed to be, in ways that normalize who we are. It is worth reminding ourselves that one of the reasons why we might be either unduly indulgent or alternately punitive toward children is because our own hold on received versions of maturity and competence is so fragile, thus expressing our own insecurities through our identification or repudiation of identification with children. This is not to say that there's no difference between children and adults, nor to summarily dismiss the real urgencies that cause adults to enact or veto policies that fail to consider the best interests of kids, nor to be unsympathetic to the ironic solidarity that emerges among parents united in their reactions to the opening strains of Baby Shark. But as Chris Jenks explains, too often, adults fail to acknowledge that much of what we see in childhood is of our own making, a a projection that too often focuses narrowly on a fragment of the experience of being a child in the world. This is a quote from Chris Jenks. While biological immaturity is a fact of childhood, the significance of these facts and the meaning attributed to them varies greatly across history and culture. What it means to be a child is determined in diverse ways by cultural and historical interpretations of the child's biological immaturity. In this sense, the concept of child and the concept of adult is as much socially constructed as it is biological and comprises a social identity. The social identity of the child marks out, among other things, what forms of action are appropriate for those classified as children. That is, for example, participation in mandatory schooling as opposed to adult world of work. Appropriate areas of knowledge for children, for example, whether children should be included in discussions pertaining to sex or death, and the conditions of a good childhood. None of these aspects of childhood is a matter of biological determination. Rather, they highlight cultural and historical interpretations of what it means to be a child, interpretations which ultimately reveal a multiplicity of childhoods in our world. For many years, I taught art education methods to prospective elementary and early childhood teachers and prompted them each semester to tap into their personal cultural histories to revive their memories of their earliest art experiences, both in a drawing and an essay to follow. All too often, they recounted memories of art in school as an adverse childhood experience, ones that had all but marked them for life. In case after case, the experiences they recalled as having turned them away from confidence in their abilities to participate in art activities seem like minor slights from an adult perspective. One sympathetic to harried teachers rushing one class out of the room as another waits in the hallway. But these apparently minor rebukes and lapses of attention leave lasting marks. Students wrote of works proudly shared, received with nothing more than, "Is your name on that?" Of being required to fill in backgrounds they had intentionally left open to acknowledge the transparency of air between earth and sky, of being reprimanded for messes that they believed to be productive explorations. Marilyn Zermelin told of watching a student teacher conduct a classic Lowenfeldian motivational dialogue with her class, inviting them to imagine life in the open prairies of the West. One child, having participated willingly in the dialogue, asked the student teacher if he could draw something he had seen on television the night before, and spoke enthusiastically about his interest in a program about cats. The student teacher, concerned about the thematic unity of the display she had envisioned, gently cajoled this child, hoping to convince him to stick to the topic of the day, and left to circulate around the room. When she returned to his desk, she saw that the child had devised a compromise, drawing a cat wearing a Stetson hat, riding on horseback. Sometimes children have the confidence to defy us. Sometimes they let us know that they're not interested in what we are proposing for them. More often than not, they simply carry those frustrations with them and come to think of art class as punitive and constraining space, the opposite of what we intend it to be. Art teacher Melissa Purdy reported on the Teaching for Artistic Behavior Facebook page. Me, how was art today? My 6-year-old son. Not good. I had a dream about Super Eli saving the world, but we just had to draw textures. Her question, how did art education become something that discourages the making of actual art? From our perspective as art teachers, raised in certain traditions of practice, such conflicts between the interests of an individual child and the generalizations about children, the single story of childhood, that guide our lesson planning, may be seen as inevitable and minor inconveniences. As an elementary art teacher, I operated, as many teachers do, on the assumption that something on offer would catch the fancy of every child in my class at some point during the year. But built into that thinking is a lack of respect for children's interests and their capacity to follow those interests to unknown but projective destinations, and a profoundly limited understanding of art and of the teacher's role in facilitating children's encounters with art and the worlds it brings into being. As Kate Atkinson points out, we have an unspoken but understood agenda for children and materials to keep them under control. Hilavi Lynn's, she writes, quoting Hilavi Lynn's Taguchi, both pain and children are bounded by these unspoken understandings, this normalizing lens that just prescribes particular ways of being and doing. To fall outside this normalizing lens is to fail at normalizing children into healthy, enlightened, and free citizens. Drawing opens up the possibilities of playful explorations into the things that matter most to children, and with that, the establishment of a subversive counterculture in the classroom. Dennis Atkinson recognizes drawing and art more broadly as an immanent force leading incursions into the unexplored, opening up to what we cannot anticipate. This adventure is the point of art making for children, the exploration of marks and meanings that emerge in concert to unanticipated ends. Perhaps the exasperated teachers who want nothing to do with Dogman or Super Eli are convinced that what they have to offer is more important, or at least a more solid justification of their professional role. Transmission and direct instruction, rather than exploration and mutual learning, place teachers, their expertise, knowledge, and worldview center stage and justify their existence. But what does this mode of teaching convey to children about themselves and their interests, about art, and how it does or does not matter? Speaking from a Deleuzian frame of reference, Tim Kennard writes of the importance of lines of flight in disrupting or deterritorializing our everyday assumptions and practices, forcing us to think differently about what we take for granted. He compares lines of flight with the desired paths created on college campuses when students repeatedly forged shortcuts across the grass, wearing paths in the dirt that counter the orderly angles of the designer's plan. A desired path, he says, resists the striations of the planners, but it is easy to see, and it highlights the exact route that is desired by the walkers. As they smooth the striated space, the destination might be surmised. A line of flight, however, has an unknown destination, its trajectory unexpected. A line of flight is a desired path without a destination. A line of flight is deterritorializing because it is a process. It does not draw new territory, nor does it chart or map what is already given. The territory available to the reader who takes a line of flight is always being created. Thus, the lines of flight that emerge as children follow their interests and inclinations, their choices in the art room, created space of possibilities, openings, ruptures, and cracks in the curriculum. They smooth out the rigid structure that we've come to accept as necessary, revealing spaces where unexpected things can happen, where the light gets in. There must be room for this to happen in a space that is dedicated to educating children in, about, and through art making. The act of interrupting the binary that hierarchizes adult and child in terms of power is an act of hopeful resistance. Very little of what I've learned in years of looking, listening, and lingering among young children is explained by or related to developmental processes or stages. In fact, it's always been specific children chasing lines of flight that in their ubiquity deny the very existence of a normal path. This is where art making happens, in these idiosyncratic and unpredictable moments when children resist categorization, where they exceed and challenge all expectations. Patricia Tarr posed the question, is development still relevant to art education? Tracing her own journey from true believer to dedicated skeptic. Our histories blind us to other possibilities, and we must continue to negotiate new possibilities, becoming cognizant of those underlying assumptions that are maintained despite evidence to the contrary. In order to break with the structured traditions of our field, rooted as they are in the childish assumptions that we share, we must begin to question and to explore new ways of being with children in the spaces that we share. How do we develop what Jorge Lucero calls a keen eye for young practitioners? How do we help others to do so? Most crucially, we might begin by resisting the taken for granted assumptions about children, our relationship to them, and their relationship to the world that constitute the single story of childhood we have internalized. To confront the powerful discourse of developmental theories, we must work with an ethic of resistance to disrupt what we take for granted and make conscious choices for practice, driven by our sense of responsibility to our new understandings of ourselves, our work, and our children. Conventional developmental theories have long constituted the dominant paradigm in art education and remain deeply ingrained presumptions guiding our practice without necessarily rising to the level of consciousness. Contemporary understandings of the interactive nature of our being in the world shift the emphasis from the individual child acting upon materials and environments to attend more closely to what occurs in children's entanglements with the human and non-human world. The encounters and events that happen between children and adults, and tools and materials and symbols and past experiences and present situations and. The story of the single child is no longer adequate. So that is how to create a single story. Show people as one thing, as only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Tina. We have some time this evening for questions. Again, you're welcome to use the chat function or the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer a few. So we have a question. The question is, and I'll go ahead and just read it so you have the full context. Thank you so much. Lots of interesting ideas. Could you talk a bit more about how you understand the role of adults in children's new materialist art education?
I think the role of adults, thank you for the question. I think the role of adults is to watch and to listen and to set conditions where children are challenged by the material and surroundings and the context of collaboration with peers and adults that that provide them with constant stimulation and constant motivation to continue their art making. So I think I think we bring new things to children. I think that's what our role as adults is. And I think we do that largely through what John Holt used to call seeding the fossil bed, that he told about taking kids out to find fossils, and they were very successful. His class was always successful in doing so. And it was because he'd been there first and he had planted some fossils for them to find. So I think, we seed the fossil bed, we make an environment that's stimulating, and we provide materials, and we provide conditions and contexts and experiences that that make art making happen. So
we have a second question as well, Tina. It says, I find it interesting that you said art has become the discouraging of actual art. Why is that? And I believe it's a question that related to your comment about art history and our values about art actually impeding the ways in which young people's art gets understood.
Yeah, I think what happens, what we see often is the substitution of adult urgencies and adult structures for children's, we take the air out of their space. So we allow them very little leeway in making the decisions that artists make. And I think we have to continually go back to thinking about, them not as, not as being engaged in an activity that's different from what adult artists do, mature artists do. We have to think about the continuity of art from preschool on, and thinking about Howard Gardner and how he talked about preschool years as the golden age of artistic expression or artistic ability in children. It was because, in large part, preschool children resist that kind of structure. There's no way that you're going to ask children who are not quite sure what's going to happen when they put, marker to paper. There's no way that you can completely control their artistic decisions. And so, yes, they're very expressive, and they're very, they're very much unique in their approach to artistry. But we take that away, and in doing so, we take away children's confidence. And we take away also their understanding of what art is, both as a collaborative venture and as something that is much broader and less constrained than what we are able to provide in a typical classroom, where the teacher is structuring the materials, deciding on the materials, the idea, the concept, the completion, the rubric, and eliminating all of the decisions that would really make it art.
I'm going to move to the chat. Tina, our next question is, do you have a favorite art activity or medium to use with kindergarten and first grade students that gives freedom and is interesting to them? And I was thinking this might be a chance to talk about sketchbooks,
yes,
which is maybe a context for a lot of what you discussed this evening.
Yeah, and the images that you see are from sketchbooks, except the one that you're seeing right now is just a play or a drawing that was left around the classroom. But mostly, I think an ideal activity, and one that I really am so enthusiastic about, is to just give children sketchbooks and time to draw in them with other children, in the company of other children and interested adults. and it's magic. I think there are a lot of incredibly wonderful materials, and there are lots of ways that teachers can structure things so that children are exploring within a particular context, but they're still exploring. One of those is to provide time to explore together with clay in a kind of structured way in dialogue with other children and with teachers. One of them is providing black and white paint only and black and white large sheets of paper, and finding out what happens, when those things start to emerge. And so I think some of the mystery in those media explorations is really vital as well for keeping options open. But as Chris mentioned, for many, many years, I've been an advocate of providing sketchbooks for children as part of the Saturday art classes that I've been involved with at the University of Illinois and then at Penn State, and also here at El Valor, where you're seeing these images from 3 to 5-year-old children. Because it provides a setting where children are able to talk to one another, to see what other children are doing, to explore their own ideas, and to have a regular space where they are in charge of the artistic decisions that they're making. So these are all in marker. Not this drawing, but the others were all in marker because that's what I provided. But in some of the classes, the children themselves decided they wanted them to be about painting. And so they were done in watercolor. And, so it's not even limited to a particular medium. It's just the idea of that open space and a space that's owned by the child. And what you learn by listening to children, particularly in preschool and kindergarten, and watching them draw and overhearing their conversations with one another is amazing. So an incredible source of information about kids.
We have a number of really excellent questions coming through. Our next question, first of all, there's a question about art without criteria, which you, I think, referring to your quote from Atkinson. But it also relates to another question that we have, which I'll read. Listening to you, I was reminded of Patty Lather's argument that we need to trouble the concepts we think with and think about. Are the concepts or categories of child, children, childhood part of the problem that you are inviting us to think about in the compelling accounts you have offered? Can we live without those categories in art education?
That's an excellent question. And I think, Gail Cannella years ago suggested that we would be better to refer to children, to what we think of as children, as younger human beings, and to think of them in that way. And, it's awkward. But yes, I kind of think it would be better if we just thought of them as younger human beings. And those categories are definitely an issue. One of the things that I refer to often is Loris Malaguzzi's idea that the image of the child is where teaching begins, and that we all carry an image of the child, that abstract, the child with us. Then it's very difficult to act in any way that's contrary to our image of the child. So if we see, for example, his example, if we think of boys and girls as being very different, in very distinct categories, then we have a difficult time in overcoming those suppositions in our teaching, and of not having that image in the back of our mind in everything we do. So I think, yes, exactly. That is troubling those concepts and beginning to think differently about younger human beings is a critical way to move beyond this sort of childish notion, and, you know, to incorporate a very much more generous and mutual relationship with kids.
Tina, I'm going to ask two questions because they're somewhat related. In the Q&A, Lillian asked, how can this approach to allowing children to explore art making without step-by-step teacher directions work for an early childhood art classroom or in general? And then there's another question in the chat, and I'm going to read, in a lesson, where would you say the line is? At what point are educators taking too much control and providing too much structure that it removes the decision and the artistic nature?
Those are both excellent questions. I think maybe answering the second one first. I think that when we begin to, and this all kind of goes back to Brent Wilson, everything goes back to Brent Wilson. And Arthur Efland and the school art style and their formulation way back in the 70s of that idea of what school art is, that we've sort of created a style of art making that is unique to schools, that doesn't really relate directly to what children do on their own, and it doesn't relate to the art world. Or at least the contemporary art world. I think we've done, since then, we are relating more closely to the art world, but kind of a delayed response almost to that. But I think when we are making all of the decisions that and we do this in, you know, because of efficiency. And I hope one of the things that was clear in my paper is that, you know, these decisions that we make have logical and reasonable basis. And one of the things that our teachers are confronted with all the time is, how do you do this in half an hour? You know, and how do you take that class of 25, 30 kids and, you know, run them through in half an hour, and then there's another group waiting in the hallway. And we do that by having the same materials. We have a single topic. We have, you know, so we're making all the decisions for children in advance. And it's fun, you know, because we're doing all the creative work, but it doesn't leave the children with much to do that's really very creative. And, you know, so I think if we're defining both the medium and the topic, we've gone too far. And I think we have to, you know, begin to think about ways that we can incorporate greater degrees of freedom in the classroom and, you know, just slowly kind of move toward a more open way of allowing children's worlds into the classroom as well, because they are the experts there. We really don't know, you know, well, what it is that matters to them, unless we're extremely attentive to what they are doing. And remind me about Lillian's question.
It said, how can this approach to allowing children to explore art making without step-by-step teacher directions work for an early childhood classroom? And she's asking for her ECE students.
Okay, and I think that the traditional way that art was experienced in early childhood classrooms before we started seeing that kind of push down of premature kind of academic learning. And, you know, the teaching of reading and the teaching of phonics and the teaching of math concepts and all of the things that have appeared in preschool and kindergarten that used to be the province of first grade. Before that, classrooms were largely organized by centers, and the centers were largely organized around materials. So that setting up, say, for example, a provocation, what Reggio Emilia refers to as a provocation, where there might be a vase of sunflowers and some brown paper and some marking tools to explore, makes a suggestion to children without giving them that step-by-step, organization of kind of paper plate bunnies, so that we are giving children more options for exploring things. And they might just, sit and talk about the flowers. They might just play with them. They might, look for a while. They might make a few marks. They might, look for colors that are similar to what they're seeing, so that it is infinitely more productive in terms of learning about things than it is for us to give them a pattern and a structure that's step by step. So I think letting the materials speak to them and letting them speak back to the materials and having a dialogue is really probably what I would say would be the way to go.
We have time for one last question. How do you go about assessing students who stray from the original project and do something they truly want to do, like Super Eli? I would never want to fail a student, especially if they are doing something exceptionally imaginative, but grades are such a big factor in so many educational settings.
They are, and I think grades, I think that we have to reclaim our professionalism too. And that perhaps that's the answer, that we in some ways need to be able to say, okay, this isn't what I had intended, but this is what this child intends. And that we judge the work on its merit, just as we would if we were looking at adult work. And, and that we also sort of insist that the process of making become respected as a huge part of the evaluation of what children make, because sometimes what they make is not at all, it's not at all captured in the page that they turn into you at the end of the session. So there could be a tremendous amount of learning that's happening in the conversation that occurs, in the way that they were watching other kids draw and learning from them, in the kind of thinking that's happening around their work. So, to be able to take all of that into account in the evaluation, I think is really important. And we need to maybe insist that evaluations for art make room for that. So.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening and for sharing your work. For those of you who took time out of your schedules to join us, thank you. We appreciate your support and hope you found this evening's presentation to be as inspiring as we did. As a final reminder, to learn more about our work and current initiatives, please take some time to visit our website at www.centerforthestudyofchildhoodart.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CSCA_childart and on Instagram at UARC_Center for Childhood Art. To receive, UARC_Center for Child Art. To receive updates about future events, please subscribe to our mailing list. This can be done by visiting our website. The subscription sign up is located at the bottom of our homepage. While this is the final event for this year's Childhood Art Speaker Series, we are very much in the process of planning next year's events, which to this point includes presentations by Dr. Tron Templeton and Dr. Vivek Belanki, Dr. Mona Sacher, Dr. Gail Bolt, and Dr. Hannah Dyer. Again, thank you, Dr. Thompson, and thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hayon. And thanks to everybody.
And for those of you who submitted questions and we didn't get to them, please know that we will be sharing all of the questions from the chat and the Q&A with Dr. Thompson following this evening's presentation.
Great.
And hope to see you next time.
Thank you.